All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to FAMM's Heart to Heart series. My name is Kevin Ring. I'm president of FAMM. We're excited today to talk about the need to expand compassionate release in the States. As many people know, FAMM is pursuing and promoting a second chances agenda that is designed to attack extreme, excessive sentences, both at the state and federal level. And one of the major components of that agenda is reforming our compassionate release laws. We lock people up for so long that we're turning our prisons and penitentiaries into nursing homes, and it doesn't make us any safer. We waste a lot of money, and it is cruel to keep people who are not, in any position to commit crime, who have been separated from their families so long, to stay in prison when it is not providing the public any benefit. And so we've been pursuing that primarily at the federal level through the sentencing work at the Sentencing Commission with members of Congress. And we were pleased in 2018, the First Step Act included reforms that we had been promoting to help improve that process so that people could get an answer quickly and get some resolution. And what we saw was this was a program that was needed even in the best of times, and then it was absolutely critical when COVID-19 hit, because there were no mechanisms to get people out of federal prison. And so despite the opposition from the Department of Justice in a number of cases, prisoners and their families have been able to apply for compassionate release. If they get rejected by the Bureau of Prisons, they've been able to go to court and seek relief there. And we're happy to say that over 1,600, we'll get the details soon, over 1,600 have been released, and that is more than in any previous year by far. And we've heard from a lot of families with loved ones in state prison who similarly hope to get their loved one out of harm's way, but there are not the same mechanisms in states for compassionate release. This has been a huge problem. Again, it's been exacerbated by COVID-19. And so we're hoping that through our Second Chances agenda that we can work with lawmakers and elected officials at the state level to pursue compassionate release expansion at the state level. Today, we're going to talk to a couple of experts in directly impacted people, because this week the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released a new report about how to mitigate the spread of COVID-19 in our nation's prisons and jails. And that was put together by a panel of experts that they convened. And one of those experts is with us right now. That's UCLA Professor of Law, Sharon Dolovich, who is also the faculty director of UCLA's Prison Law and Policy Program. We're also joined by Mary Price, FAMM's General Counsel, who has been working on compassionate release for 2 decades and whose work really was culminated with the passage of the First Step Act's federal reforms, and who also authored a report called Everywhere and Nowhere, which was a comprehensive examination of state compassionate release programs. And we're also really excited to have Quentin Burt with us, whose story we've told and whose story we followed, but it's the first time we're really getting a chance to talk to him. He was released thanks to the First Step Act's compassionate release programs in July. And so we're excited to hear his story. But I wanted to start with Sharon, because you were on the National Academy's team that was tasked with coming up with recommendations. I want to ask you, what was the mandate and what did you all find? And thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. So the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine they convene these expert panels periodically when there are issues of public policy import for which there is sufficient evidence to offer recommendations that are non-political. Oh, you see my cats are doing some things in the background. Sorry about that. And so this was deemed an issue, COVID behind bars and the implications of COVID behind bars was deemed an issue where there was plenty of evidence and a lot, maybe too much politics. And so the idea was to bring a bunch of experts together to try to figure out what recommendations can be made to try to mitigate the spread of COVID in a nonpartisan, evidence-based way. So really the focus of the report and of the panel's work was on decarceration as a mitigating strategy. And the basic idea, which your viewers and FAMM members will know very well, is there's only so much you can do to move the deck chairs around on the Titanic inside a prison or a jail when you're trying to prevent the spread of COVID. You can give PPE, you can make sure people have hand sanitizer, you can try to quarantine people with symptoms, but ultimately, if you don't reduce the population density in a facility, you're not really going to be able to prevent the spread, rapid spread of COVID inside, because people just can't socially distance in crowded cells, crowded dorms, crowded facilities. Even if facilities are not overcrowded, just running them at the numbers that they are supposed to be at, facilities are just too crowded. And so we really focused in the report on decarceration as a strategy, and many of our recommendations were directed in that way.
Can you give us the sort of the top line on sort of the top recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, the main, I mean, there are two sort of halves of the recommendations. Wow, a lot's going on here. There are two pieces to the report. The first one is urging public officials with the power to decarcerate to find ways to reduce the size of their populations inside. And the other half is about reentry, how to do reentry safely and giving people who are released enough support. So I'll focus on the decarceration side, which I think is the most interest right now to this conversation. And we really recommended what kind of common sense. On the one hand, we recommended that on the front end, there be as much diversion as possible. So no incarceration for low-level misdemeanors, avoiding pretrial detention as much as possible, not incarcerating people for failure to pay fines and fees, those kinds of moves. And on the releases side, what we urged was that corrections officials work with every possible public official with the power to decarcerate to identify people who would be safe for release. And there we were thinking both of, people who are pose no public safety threat, who may not themselves be vulnerable to COVID. And then of course, to identify those people inside who have vulnerabilities to COVID because of age or medical condition, and then getting those people released.
Yes, so Mary, you've been following this and promoting this for 2 decades. And I mean, I know we're excited to see these recommendations because it was consistent with what we've seen. Can you talk a little bit about what the expert committee recommended and how that sort of jives with your understanding of what needs to be done?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks a lot to Sharon and the National Academies. It's an amazing report. I haven't finished all of it, but we hit some of the high points, and it's really terrific. I think the recommendation, of course, that really caught my attention was the recommendation with respect to compassionate release policies. The report identified that there were some significant weaknesses in the ability of states to use compassionate release. I mean, almost every state in the District of Columbia have some form of what we call compassionate release. But even in I don't want to say best of times, because it's not best of times, but even absent COVID, those systems were not using the authorities to release individuals that even the state laws and rules identified as being eligible for compassionate release. So people who are terminally ill, people who are extremely debilitated, people who are of a certain age and have served a significant amount of time. And those authorities are often in place, but they weren't being used. And so when COVID-19 struck, we all knew that one of the most vulnerable of populations would be people who are incarcerated. And I remember, Kevin, I think we talked about this at the beginning of all this. We went back and took a close look at all of the compassionate release authorities because we'd done these 50 state memos. We had a pretty good idea of what some of the opportunities and barriers were presented. And really what we saw when we looked at them were a set of barriers. And unfortunately, I think, and Sharon and her team at UCLA are working to confirm this, but unfortunately, I think we were right. The compassionate release statutes and authorities in the states had no ability to address this pandemic and to be used as a tool of decarceration. Which is, this is really quite too bad because there aren't a lot of other things out there. So what the report does is to recommend, after looking at some of the barriers for compassionate release and comparing, I think, the situation in the states with the rather new authority in the federal system, which we can talk about later, which we have been able to use, What the report recommended, or what the National Academies recommended, is that given the extreme medical vulnerability of incarcerated people to COVID-19, so these are people with underlying medical conditions, right, that make them particularly at risk for serious illness or death should they contract the virus. It recommended that federal and state policymakers revise compassionate release policies to account for petitioners' medical conditions, age, and other kinds of impairments or family circumstances. And it also recommends, and I just thought this was so important, it said, because of the severity of the health risks, applications for compassionate release should be reviewable by courts or some other decision maker who's external to the standard parole process. And I thought that was super important.
Well, let me ask you both that right there. When we talk about barriers, let's be specific. What is stopping people? Because a lot of families reached out to us and said, my loved one's in state prison, not federal. Can they apply for compassionate release? And we'd look at their system and say we couldn't. But what was it that was stopping them? Was it not a mechanism existed? Did it just not? People weren't eligible because of the crime they committed. What are the specific barriers that stand in the way? Either of you.
All of the above.
Yeah, I was about to say yes. Yes is the answer. I mean, as Mary knows well, that in some states you have to be 6 months. You have to get a certificate from a doctor saying you're 6 months from death before you could be released. So there's that kind of concern. One of the big concerns that Mary's been working with our students on this project on state compassionate release, and one of the things we've been talking about is the way that when you have the decider being the parole board, which in most state systems, the parole board decides the question of compassionate release. You have people who spend their time thinking just about people the crimes they committed, their disciplinary history in prison, what the victims' families want, when they're thinking about whether to grant parole. And now we're asking them to put on a totally different perspective and think about what's humane with respect to the human beings inside prisons. And it's just hard, I think, for them to reorient their perspective. So I think, Mary's colleague was saying, jailers go to jail. I think that was your line, Kevin. Jailers go to jail. We quoted that line, and I think I've had that in mind ever since. That's exactly right.
Mary, do you want to add to that? Is this a lack of political will, or is it a lack of process?
I think it's all of those things. I mean, when we wrote our report, we identified a number of barriers that we saw the state policies and programs had erected. Some of them were, as Sharon points out, very strict eligibility criteria. I mean, in one state, you have to have a diagnosis of 30 days to death to be eligible for release based on your terminal condition. Well, it might take 6 months for the reviewing process in that state to get to you. So part of it is strict eligibility requirements. Part of it is exclusions. Part of it is layers and layers of review. Part of it is eligibility criteria or processes that are not clear. So you have corrections officials and medical staff who don't know what their job is. And so a petition might land on their desk and they don't know what to do with it. And of course, then they get stuck. And then just some really terrible time frames. And then political will. I think that, for policymakers and stakeholders to, they have to embrace this concept that number one, we need to remove certain people from prison because their continued incarceration no longer meets the purposes of punishment. From a moral standpoint, from a financial standpoint, you name it, there are people that shouldn't be there. And then you have crises like this, right? Where we have to be able to move quickly. And we just looked at the state systems and said, there's no ability to do that. Whereas when we looked at our new federal system, we said, this just might work.
Right.
We have to make it work.
Let's create some political will then. Quentin, there was no reason for you to serve 30 years in federal prison. Your original sentence was a travesty, but be that as it may, that's what you were headed for. What was it like when COVID hit in the prisons? What was the reaction from people inside? What were you thinking when this came about?
Actually, when I first heard about the COVID spreading, I was concerned a lot about my family because had no way of really reaching them in a way that, to be there with them personally. Unfortunately, I was in detention at this time when this was going on. So I couldn't contact my family. All I was hearing through staff, they was giving us numbers that people were catching it, people was dying or we would get some type of report back through an inmate who might have had a radio in detention. And so I was terrified a lot. My father had contracted the virus. He survived. My younger brother, he had contracted it while I was in detention. So I was really concerned. So in the prison system, in the cells, and I was in the dorm. So there's no social distance in the dorm. So some inmates don't take that serious. Some guys walk around, they don't mask up, they don't stay silent, keep themselves clean, whatever. Everything just congested, everybody's really close together. When you're using the phones, when you're using the computers for emails, it was just the true links, or when you're in the TV room, they say, spread the chairs 6 feet apart, but it's just the TV rooms are really small. So everybody just shoulder to shoulder. Yeah. So I was concerned a lot. I didn't want to die in prison. And
how long were you in, like when March, when it hit, how long had you already been serving?
At that point, I was already served 30 years.
You had already
sentence?
No, how long had you served to that point?
As far as my time?
Yeah, how much of your sentence had you already served?
30 years.
You had already been in 30 years. Oh, right. Yeah. Right. Because you're right. You went in at 20.
Right.
And how old are you now?
51.
Right. So you got out in July. So how'd you get out? You must have heard about.
So I heard something. Yes, I heard about it when I was in detention. My wife wrote me a letter, and she was telling me, because when administration came through, the warden and all the other staff, they would come through detention. They never told us anything about the compassion release. So she wrote me a letter, and she was telling me about this compassion release. I was familiar with the motion, the 3582, which inmates have to file to petition to get released. But I didn't know that this program or this release was going on at the time. So when she told me about it, she said she had contacted FAMM, of course, and did a questionnaire about my medical conditions and things. And
can you address that? Can I interrupt you to ask that? What was your condition?
Well, I had hypertension, diabetes, and some kidney problems.
And were people around you at all contracting it at your facility?
Well, they didn't report it. If it was, I know one staff member had contracted it. That was it. Like I said, I was never tested until the day I was being released. So I didn't know if anybody had it or not. They wouldn't release that information if that was the case,
And was the staff taking precautions? I know you said that some of the people you were serving with, some were wearing masks, some weren't. How was it with the staff?
They would say, well, when you go to when we was going to get our lunch and dinner, whatever, the staff would have their masks on. But when I was in detention, a lot of them didn't have their masks. They would make jokes of it. They walk around coughing. People would complain like, this virus is spreading. Y'all taking this as a game, So I was concerned about that because I knew it was airborne, And so they would stand on us about wearing a mask, but half the time they didn't even wear masks. So that was a big concern because we knew that on the way the virus would get into prison, it had to be through staff. Inmates, we can't leave out. Yeah. We already quarantined pretty much.
Yeah. So with your help of your wife and everyone who follows FAMM knows Pam because she's such an active member and she's such a booster for you. You file, and what are your expectations? What are you thinking?
I had hopes, and so when we got a contact with Mr. Palmer, my attorney that represented me, we talked, conference, calls, and I was explaining the situation to him that I was not being treated for my health issues at the time, so I was concerned. because I know on CDC guidelines, people who had a higher risk of contracting the virus, people who had diabetes and medical conditions like me. So I was telling him I wasn't being treated. And so once I shared all my medical conditions with him, he was preparing a motion and he did submit it. So his thing was wanted to find out what was the government's position. Were they going to oppose the motion? And so we had to wait on that. And so I guess after a couple of weeks, the government did respond to him, and he emailed me and said, well, the good news, they conceded, they agreeing with me that should be released. And so his thought was that the courts still might not grant me the relief, and it was in their hands. So he figured it would take about 2 weeks before we heard from the judge. But actually, it was the next day it was made. And I couldn't even believe it. My counselor came to me. He said, Burt, pack up. And I was like, wondering, for what? He said, you going to the hole. I thought I'd done something wrong, so what I'm going to the hole for? So he said, well, that attorney called us and you have to go to quarantine. So I knew then that I was being released. So I was just really overwhelmed because I waited so long, and I just kept hope. And I didn't want to never lose focus on that, because I like, well, I spent 30 years in prison, and I believe that God had a bigger purpose for me. Jehovah had the biggest purpose for me, not to do all this time and just, die here because of this virus. So with that in mind, I kept encouraging my wife, like, I know this is a break for us. I know that this is about to happen. So I guess I stayed in prayer a lot, Kevin. I did. I prayed a lot, and I was hoping a lot, because when I was reading all of the reports on the treatments, the death rate of inmates that was contracting the virus and that were dying, I was like, well, I hope this will never happen to me. I want to live. I want to go out and experience life. I've been gone for so long. I want to know what it means to live. And like I said, I've never seen anyone die at the facility that I was at, but I knew it was a high possibility.
Yeah. Well, you're getting lots of people in the comments already saying, welcome home. They're glad you're home. I know that feeling. You get called to the bubble. It's either very good news or very bad news. So I'm glad you got good news. No, as soon as the government didn't oppose yours, which is rare, that was a good sign.
Yes.
Let me just ask you
Can I
this.
ask Quentin a question?
Yeah.
So Quentin, did you have to go to the hole for 14 days before they let you out?
Yeah, they quarantined me for 2 weeks, and I was actually quarantined. I had to be quarantined 2 weeks at home. The judge, he ordered me to be quarantined 2 weeks at home, and he revoked my supervisor lease, so I didn't have any paper also.
What was that like, those 2 weeks before you left, knowing you were going to go home?
It was a mental thing. So I I don't want to freak out in here, because I'm excited to go home, and I can't go nowhere. But the last day, that night, anxiety hit me heavy. And it was a staff member there. He was really nice, and we talked, and he was working in the hole at the time with me, and he was like, wish me well. He said, I'm really glad that you get released. I said, don't come back. He said, I hope you make something out of your life. And it was my first time even talking with the staff. And I had anxiety that night, really, really hard. And I was so anxious in the morning. I said, when they coming to get me? When they coming to get me? They said, well, if 9 o'clock, you're going to be leaving out of here.
If you screwed that up, you would have been in big trouble.
Yes.
Let me ask you this, though. Let's shift back to policy now. So you come home in July. Couldn't be more excited. And we'll end up talking more about your transition, I imagine. But now think about this from a policy standpoint. The states don't have this. I mean, there are people out there who are saying they're opposing these compassionate release programs. They're saying people like you should just serve your time. If COVID hits, well, that's too bad. It hits on the outside too. So what would you say to people? I mean, aside from the fact that you were over sentenced, why should people what should lawmakers, if you were talking to members of Congress or state legislatures, what would you say, Quentin, to say, don't forget about me? Or like, what would be your argument as to why they should show some concern about people who are incarcerated?
I think they should look at it from a point of view that we still people, we human. People make mistakes. We already serve our time. Our punishment is being incarcerated, but you shouldn't have to sit there and wait to die because of a virus that you have no control over. Rather, you won't catch it being free or in prison. It shouldn't change the fact that you should be looked at as a human being, to be given a fair chance to go home. Because I tell you, the things I experienced in being in prison, when you get sick, it's hard to get staff there to help you. I've seen a lot of people die in prison because of negligence with medical treatments you're supposed to get. And that was always a big fear factor for me.
Yeah.
So because of that, they're not going to attend to your medical need with this COVID virus spreading in the prison system. A lot of people go home where they can get treatment with family members that can help them. Don't let them just sit there and just die and no one's really there to tend for them, don't really care if they pass away. So they just looking at, okay, you locked up, you doing your time. Okay, this is a different issue now. Our life is at risk because of a virus that no one can control. So if it's a high risk someone contracting the virus and you putting their life at risk because you feel they should be punished, I think that view is wrong.
Yeah.
Like I said, we're still human, and everybody should have a chance to live, regardless of what you've done.
I just want to take a time out to say that some people will think this is some break, but I just want to put a point on how obscene our sentencing laws are. That you serve 30 years and that you getting out is perceived as some break. I mean, it's ridiculous. And the idea that you got some windfall or luck because a deadly disease swept into prisons and you were able to get out after only 30 years is absurd. Mary, I want to ask you a question because we're getting some questions coming in. Somebody asked, how many times can you apply for compassionate release? And can you ask for a different judge? Somebody was denied and obviously they prefer a different judge.
Sure, that's an excellent question. There's no limit on the amount of times that you can ask for compassionate release, and there are no limits on the number of times that one can file a motion in court. And I will tell you that sometimes when our volunteer attorneys for the Compassionate Release Clearinghouse lose a case, they want to go right to the Court of Appeals because they're fighting and they're fighters. And we say, slow down, wait a minute. Because frequently those denials are because the judge isn't convinced that the individual meets the compassionate release criteria, that they're vulnerable to COVID-19, and or that they didn't deserve to go home, right? They looked at the person as a whole and they said, well, maybe still a danger to the community or something along those lines. So if we rush to the Court of Appeals, right, you might get a Court of Appeals opinion saying, well, this judge has extreme discretion, which is true. In other words, the judge gets to make those decisions, and we can only overturn that decision if they've abused their discretion. Well, they didn't abuse their discretion, and we think they're right. So then you have two courts saying no, and a place for the district court to hide if you go back. If you don't go to court on an appeal, and something does change. So for example, right now, Oxford Federal Correctional Institution is blowing up with cases. 70% of people in that prison have tested or are testing positive for COVID-19 right now. Now, a judge who may have turned down somebody from Oxford might look at them again, or you may have them come back in with a lawyer. They maybe didn't have a lawyer before who makes some very good arguments about why you deserve to go home. So you can do that as many times as you'd like. And we in the clearinghouse are aware of a number of cases that have been granted on the second or third attempts. So it's not, there's no limit.
But you're not going to get a different district court judge.
Yeah, I forgot that part. No, you won't, because the decision about compassionate release is made by the sentencing court, and it's a reduction in the sentence. So you have to go back to the court, assuming your judge hasn't retired or died or whatever, gone to senior status or is otherwise busy. But that's who you're going to be in front of. Mm-hmm.
Mary, and can you, let's put Quentin's release into context. How many people have been released this year, or like since COVID hit, or what are the numbers?
Yeah, so it's not enough, but I smiled because it's in such stark contrast. So before the changes to the compassionate release statute were made, so back in the day when only the Bureau of Prisons could bring motions, a handful every year were granted, between 24 and 50 at the most. In the first year, 2019, last year, just last year, on the first year after the change to the law that allowed individuals who are incarcerated to go to court, in addition to, to the Bureau of Prisons to seek their release, 145 motions were granted. Some of those were brought by the Bureau of Prisons, more were brought by individuals who were incarcerated. In the first 2 months of 2020, 21 people got compassionate release. Since March of 2020, since the beginning of March to today, 1,700 people have been granted federal compassionate release. Now, that's still, I think, something like a third of all the people. There are other people who have been denied, of course, but it's still a monumental change.
I just want to, Sharon, I'm going to ask you a really hard question, so brace for that. But there's another question or comment that came in. Somebody's got a friend at Danbury, and they were asking about compassionate release. They think their loved one qualifies, but BOP says they don't. And they've heard that Barr says he's released 6,500 people, and they said the Marshall Project said that only 156 have. I'm not sure where the Marshall Project number comes from. There are two release mechanisms that are being used right now. One is home confinement, which is under the sole discretion of the Justice Department and Bureau of Prisons. And I think they're somewhere around 7,000. That number is not clear to me. Some of those people were already in halfway houses or home confinement and just got released early. A lot of people did leave from prison, Paul Manafort being the most notable, but a lot of people towards the end of their sentences, mostly from camps. And then compassionate release, the numbers Mary just mentioned, 1,700. Now those were usually, unlike Quentin's case, over the objection of the Justice Department. But so we've seen 8,000 plus releases. So I'm not sure what that number, what the Marshall Project was referring to with the 156. I want to get us moving and thinking about state reform though, because that's the system where we need it. And Sharon, what do you think, to me, the $1 million 800-pound elephant, or whatever your metaphor is that the state prison populations are different. So there's a lot of people in the federal system like Quentin who are serving these long drug sentences. And I think it's a little easier for people to wrap their heads around letting them out early. Whereas in the state system, there's only about 15 to 17% are serving drug offenses, and the rest are violent and other types of offenses. And so decision makers are a little more nervous about that. How should we think about that, and how do we overcome the inevitable objections we're going to hear when people think about letting people out who committed different offenses?
So first thing is, I think you're exactly right that there is a different political calculation, and there is still, notwithstanding that there has been a shift in public opinion on how to respond to, crime and punishment, and how to think about people who are incarcerated, how to think about prison sentences. I still think state lawmakers are very afraid to seem soft on crime. And so the big problem is there's a much higher number of people in state prisons whose crimes are classified as violent, as we classify crimes. So I would say that there's some messaging challenges here, but I think they can be met. So the first thing is there are, tens of thousands of people around the country, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who are lifers, who have served long, decades in prison. And if you're a lifer, it means most of the time you went in because you committed a serious violent crime. But the numbers on recidivism for people who are released after serving decades on a life sentence are negligible. And so what we're talking about here are people who may have at one time done a bad thing and really hurt somebody, but they've, as you said about Quentin, they've served decades. They're different people. They're no longer a public safety threat. So I think one of the things we have to do is change the messaging around what that population is, what it means for their continued incarceration and their release, because I think the vast majority of those people could be safely released tomorrow and be as law-abiding and productive citizens as anybody else. And then the other thing is, for people who aren't lifers, I think we have to really push back against the official designation of what counts as a violent crime. Because all the data on media perceptions show that when you ask people, your average person in the street who doesn't think a lot about these issues, to give you what they think about when they think about criminals, they think the most violent serial kill, maybe they're watching a lot of television or whatever, the most violent, repeatedly violent person. And that's who they think of. If you say violent, someone who committed a violent crime, that's who they think of. But the vast majority of people who committed crimes labeled violent in custody just are nowhere near that. They were in a fight and they hit somebody, or they may have committed something that was, like, let's say an armed robbery, something that we wouldn't celebrate, but it doesn't mean that they are continually a danger to society. And so I think we really have to push back on that characterization.
Yeah, I mean,
Can I just
have a
add?
board member who committed armed robbery, and now is a Georgetown law professor. So
Right.
yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mary, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add that we've certainly in the federal system seen a number of releases, orders releasing people who were convicted of crimes of violence, both the kind of those ones on the border, are they a crime of violence or not, possessing a gun in connection with a drug trafficking offense, but real crimes of violence too, and other kinds of offenses that would make us recoil. But this is the beauty of having what the report talks about, this disinterested party in some sense, who gets to look at the entire person. So when these federal judges go back and look at this individual who they sentenced years ago based on their violent crime, and they look at their rehabilitation now, they look at the danger they're in, they realize they didn't sentence them to die in prison, many of them. They're willing to take a risk with those people. And I really appreciated the part in the report about recidivism rates for certain kinds of crimes. I really want us to dig into that more, because you gave us a lot of material to work with.
Quentin, after 30 years, I mean, did you see people like you who should have benefited from early release? I only spent a year and a half in federal prison. I saw people, I thought it was such a waste to keep them there.
Right.
They were older, they were sick, they were no threat to anyone. What did you see?
To be honest, it was a few people I've seen that I think should have been given another chance. I try to apply myself to do what was right. And I felt that they thought, because of the type of charge I had, because I had some serious weapons in my case, it prejudiced me, and I believe one of the attorneys even made that statement because of the weapons. And so I knew I was a changed person. I knew 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I wouldn't have got out and committed another crime. But it's hard to get the courts to see that view of you. They say all the thing they say, well, you committed this crime, and you had these type of weapons, you're a danger to the public and all that. But I showed them contrary, because I did program, I stayed out of trouble. I took 2 degrees, had 2 degrees in Blackstone School of Law. I attended all the programs that they made available to me. So I kept myself busy. I didn't want to waste my mind. I didn't want to waste my time and just doing dead time. So it have been other men I've seen that should have been given a break, and unfortunately they wasn't. And some people were sick that passed away that should have been on home confinement. People who had probably like a year to the door, and they were just denied, and they should be at home, not sitting in prison knowing that they're gonna pass away. Let them people go home. And I felt that I was being denied a great justice, because no one seen the potential in me. I said, wow, I know I'm a changed person. I'm doing everything that's right, but it's not enough. So when would be enough for me to be recognized? So this is a bittersweet situation, because people are getting sick and people are dying from this, but it was a blessing for me. And I think it was the only way that Jehovah made a way for me, because if it was under normal circumstances, I would have been still having the same uphill battle. I've still been going through the same thing.
I think that's I'm going to make a plug for people to support our Second Chances agenda, and to tell you to please, if you're watching, text chances to 21333 right now to learn more about it, because compassionate release is just one mechanism that should exist. And you're right, you only benefited because COVID hit and the courts were willing to look at these cases. But what you said is what we've heard from a lot of people, and what Sharon just said about the science or the data that shows after 10 or 15 years, you got the message, you had changed, you weren't the same person you were. and we do not have enough mechanisms in federal or state law to look at you again, especially in the federal system in states that don't have parole. There's no way to take a look to see if you've changed or matured, or whether our understanding of what the punishment was for your crime has changed.
Right.
So we need both, we need compassion release, we need second look mechanisms to allow people to get back to court and get another chance at sentencing. We need more clemency grants so that people can get that second chance that you're talking about. And it shouldn't take a pandemic, but here we are. And I will say this, of those mechanisms, the one that should be the least risky and least concern raising for elected officials is compassionate release, because you're talking about people who usually are sick or elderly, who don't pose a risk even in the best of times. But in a pandemic, especially when they weren't sentenced to die, we don't need them to die in prison. And so, Mary, I asked Sharon this, but you've done some work at the state level, and I know you've been in meetings with elected officials. Where do you think the hiccup comes? Where does the rubber hit the road and they say, yeah, we get that intellectually, but we're worried about doing this?
I think it's going back to political will and being concerned about the one case that might tank your next election. I think that we have said earlier in this conversation, we have to make a better case for that's probably not going to happen. And we need to be able to support lawmakers with good evidence, but also support them as people who organize communities of people who are interested in criminal justice reform. We should be there for them as well. So yeah, I think that is a lot of what nobody comes out and says to me, I'm not doing this because of that. But the minute I see somebody commissioning a study rather than drafting a bill, I'm like, yeah, really. And I think one of the things I wanted to say, and we've been thinking a lot in the last few weeks at FAMM about compassionate release in the states and having conversations. And one of the things that really struck me, and I'm going back to the exclusions piece. Remember, we talked about not having exclusions. If you have a compassionate release authority, don't say that this kind of person or that kind of person shouldn't benefit from it. If in a well-constructed system, we set up a system where we trust the process that we've developed to review the individual. We trust the criteria, and above all, we trust the decision maker. We give them the information and tools they need to make a wise decision, and then we give them the right to make that decision, right? Whether it's a judge or some other body that's equipped to do this. And but it's so it's in policymakers' hands to create a system that keeps that gets people out of prison who don't belong there or who we don't think belong there any longer, but also keep our communities safe, which is super important as well.
Yeah, and I think the federal, this year's experience has proven that to be the wise course, because the federal system does not have limits, and we've seen a lot of denials. Now, denials that we wish didn't happen, but you had courts saying, yes, this person qualifies under the criteria, but I do have concerns, as is my charge as the federal judge to decide whether this person is a risk to the public safety. Now, we don't always agree with that determination, but we trust the decision maker to make that. And in the state, that seems to be the problem. We don't have that same thing. So Sharon, I don't really even have a specific question. I just want to ask you, help us get through this. What do we need to, how do we get this process depoliticized, especially in compassion release? How do we depoliticize this to a point to say, this is a judgment we're making about health and safety that, that we can get facilitated in a way that can be done quickly? Because look, this pandemic, there's been a lot of infections, but this has not been that deadly of a disease, frankly. We could get hit with another pandemic that had a much higher mortality rate, and we need to move a lot faster, and we don't have those mechanisms. So
yeah, one of the things I was going to say is that part of our conversations in the commission was we talked about the next pandemic, because we're already responding to this one inadequately if we take the national picture as a whole, and we were offering recommendations for what we ought to do now, but also what we ought to be doing going forward, so that when we come to the next moment, we actually have the mechanisms in place. And I think there's no silver bullet. as you know, Mary's saying, it's a political question. So I feel like there are a few strategies. We need to try to lower the temperature on the discussion as much as possible. We have to remind, you know, as Quentin was saying, I think all of our message should be uniform, that we're talking about human beings who were not sentenced to die. They were sentenced to deprivation of liberty only. And so to leave people who are sentenced to deprivation of liberty only in crowded facilities during a pandemic is basically violating our own commitments to them and to the society as a whole. So I think we have to humanize, and we have to, as I said, lower the temperature and stick to the evidence. Because most people who are in prison right now in this country do not need to be there for public safety reasons. There's just no good reason to keep them there. I'll say one other big takeaway from the report, which I think is relevant here, is what we advocated was shifting the focus away from a narrow public safety frame where you're only looking at the person who committed the crime itself, and their victims and potential future victims, and putting incarceration in a broader public health frame where we see these as what they are, which are institutions embedded in society. You know, as what I was saying, people who are in custody can't go in and out of facilities, but staff go in and out every single day. And the pandemic has really shown a light on the way. What happens in prison has a huge impact on the community. And so I just think we have to help the public really understand. We're talking about human beings, we're talking about socially embedded institutions. And we don't just, when we incarcerate, take people and make them invisible somewhere else. They remain part of society. And so if we want to think about the health of the society as a whole, we have to think in a healthier way about prisons. I feel like that's the only way.
Well, Mary, you know, actually then the bigger issue is, I mean, the public safety is part of it, and people worried about, like you said, the Willie Horton, they're worried about the one person who's going to get out and reoffend, but we also are in a climate where there's a lot of talk about raising the voice of victims, whether it's in a sort of a progressive model of restorative justice, or if it's just, the push for Marcy's Law to give victims more rights over proceedings. And that plays into this as well, because, we have a third-party punishment system that might say, look, this person's not a threat any longer, and they should deserve to go home to be with their family. And that a victim's voice may come in and say, well, you did something bad to my loved one, and we didn't get that luxury. And so how do we balance victims, I wouldn't say rights, but victims' interests in this equation in a way that will make policymakers comfortable? What do they need to, how should they look at that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly important what victims endured in the process. And we already, and I think in a lot of ways, give victims voice either directly in the prosecution of an individual or in the sentencing, and certainly by the representation through the district attorney or the U.S. attorney. But it's not the only voice. And I think one of the things, when you started asking this question, I thought what you were heading for is, what do we do to make sure that people, when they return to the community, how do we ensure that we support them in a way that makes sure that they live law-abiding and blameless lives going forward? And one of the things I really appreciated about this report is that you talk a lot about that, right, Sharon? There's this sort of section about, how do we help people re-enter safely? And I think those two things come together, because if we can make the case that we are a society who's also responsible for people who are incarcerated in a way that they are eventually, whether by way of compassionate release or in the normal course, are going to return home or to some community, what are we doing to ensure that there's housing and income support and insurance and jobs and all the things that we demand as free citizens, right? What are we doing to sort of prepare people for normalcy again? And I think that to the extent that we can begin to build those systems in at the back end, and we have to start while people are incarcerated with lots and lots of things that they do, but also with, social workers who are doing release planning and getting families ready. To the extent that we can convince communities and victims advocates and victims that this person is coming home at a different time and with different supports, and that somebody is judged that they are no longer a threat to you in the community, I think that there will be confidence will be easier to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We're going to wrap up here in a second. I just want to mention, we got a question from Margaret about why BOP is moving people right now. And I know I've heard this concern that they just moved a bunch of people from Elkton to Fort Dix, and there's an outbreak, and so people are very concerned. Totally understand. I think BOP didn't do movements for several months, and I think now they are trying to, spread out their population again for all sorts of reasons, including programming. But I have heard concerns from people that they're being moved far away from home for reasons that don't seem to have anything to do with programming. So that's something we should look into. So thanks for raising that. I don't really have an answer as to why that is. COVID's rising everywhere, inside and outside facilities right now. So I can understand why people are concerned. So this is the time where we usually just go around and we give final thoughts. And I want to start with Quentin and ask you, well, first of all, I want to welcome you home again. I want to say the best thing you do for this cause is just to do well and succeed. And that becomes then the model that we point to say why we can have these programs. And so, we want to support you in any way we can and just wish you the best of luck. I know you have a good support system, but second chances, we'll get more second chances for others if the people who get them use them well. Right. So we wish you the best of luck. But tell us, what's the adjustment been like? I mean, that's a long time to be inside. I can't imagine going to a supermarket or driving a car or what the heck all that's like. So.
Well, adjustment been it been good. My wife helped me get myself together, and I got my driver license now. Waiting on my Social Security card, because when I left, when I was released, the prison misplaced my Social Security card. So I had to get all the documentation, send that off. I'm waiting on that. As I'm just trying to launch my business right now, and keeping myself just busy, helping my wife much as I can, spending the time with my family, kept just here and there. My focus is really trying to get my youth program going. That's something I did for 2.5 years when I was at the camp in Ashland, because I have a heart for kids and allow me to be aware about these laws, so they don't have to experience what I did, what I experienced. Because once they get in there, it's a different ball game. They don't understand the rules in there and how different it is out in the free world. You just want to dictate to you about your life, when you can get up, when you can eat, when you can sleep. So I want to be able to share that with them. And so right now, I'm supposed to be meeting with another organization. It's called Chance for Life. They on a state level. So supposed to have a meeting with them, and hopefully, working hand in hand with them, I share my ideas with them also, and they can kind of launch me in, a different direction as well. That's my main focus right now, is their youth program outside my business ideas.
Yeah, well, good for you. I mean, just the fact that you're having to fight so hard to get a Social Security card is just a reminder of how difficult we make it for people to succeed when they come out. Just those basic things. We should be doing better than that. But anyway, best of luck to you. Sharon, last thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, just a few things. First of all, the work your organization does is marvelous, and I've really had an opportunity to benefit from it. And Mary and Juliana have really helped us with our project. And so I just want to thank you all for everything you do. A couple of things. One is I just wanted to mention that since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been spearheading something called the UCLA Law COVID-19 Behind Bars Data Project. Mm-hmm. And we're doing all kinds of things. We're tracking releases, we're tracking grassroots organizing, we're gathering all the court filings. We're also scraping the data every single day from all the dashboards around the country. So if anyone on this call wants to find out what's happening in the facilities, with their loved ones, they could go on. If you just Google UCLA COVID Behind Bars Data Project, you'll come to our spreadsheet and you can get the data there. I just want to say one other thing. You just mentioned the point about transfers from Elkton. And it just reminds us that in this time, there's no risk-free option. One of the pushes by attorneys on behalf of people in Elkton was to get people out of the facility that has a high COVID rate. And then what happens if you move some of them, then you put them in other facilities. So I feel like it's a kind of fool's errand on the part of the state to try to find out the perfect 100% risk-free strategy. So I think we have to be making educated guesses and not writing people off, but trying to figure out what the smartest moves are. And sometimes you can't see every step in front of you, but you take 3 smart steps and then you think about how to get farther. And I think we just have to keep pushing in that direction. So that's what I would say. And thank
Well,
everybody
thanks
for all the work you're doing.
thanks for joining us, and thanks for the work you're doing. Mary?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be bookended as I am on my screen by Quentin and by Sharon. What a terrific panel you have helped make this. So thank you so much. So I think the one thing I want to say is at the beginning of this, and Kevin will remember when the pandemic began and we sat and we thought about, do we have the tools? Does our federal system at least have the tools to rescue people? Because we saw this as a rescue operation when we started to set up the clearinghouse. And, but I want us, and something you said earlier, Kevin, I want us to go sort of beyond the rescue operation. I hope that we can transform this conversation not only to ensuring that every jurisdiction has the means to go back and revisit individuals who are at risk of dying or are seriously ill and have the means to let them out, but also that as criminal justice system, we go back and we look and we say, why is this person sentenced to 30 or more years? What are we doing to restore the integrity of our system by going back and looking at who we incarcerate for how long and for what reasons, and giving whatever the authority is, judges or systems, the ability to go back and say, we've changed our mind. We wouldn't sentence that individual today to 30 years, or you can't do that anymore, or whatever it is. And we just don't have the universal ability to sort of take that second look and give people second chances. So I really do want to plug, you already did it, Kevin, but plug our Second Chances campaign, because I want us, the things that we learned about who's incarcerated by looking at the dangers that people were exposed to in COVID-19 should make us jump to the next step to take. That's the first 3 steps that Sharon talks about. We've got a lot more down the road, and one of them ought to be to go back and rescue people who shouldn't be there in the first place.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. I'm going to say that today the United States Bureau of Justice Statistics released a new report based on the prisoners in state and federal prisons in 2019. So this is their most recent report, came out today. And it shows we're at the lowest incarceration rate since 1995, which is 25 years. Now, everyone knows we still have the highest incarceration rate in the world, but we're making progress. I mean, we're going in the right direction, and not as fast as some of us would like. But, if you're going to make progress, you want to do this in smart ways. And we've done a lot of things like getting rid of the disparity between crack and powder cocaine, laws that made no sense, getting rid of 3 strikes laws that made no sense, that didn't keep us safer. If you wanted to approach this in a rational way, you would not just indiscriminately pick people, throw and reduce the prison population willy-nilly. You would try to do it in a targeted way that reduce the prison population without jeopardizing public safety, and in fact could increase public safety. And the reason we're so focused on Second Chances agenda is because we are convinced that these long, extreme sentences are not making us safer, and they're very expensive. And so they come at a cost of doing other things that might make us safer. And we can disagree what those things are going to be. Some people are going to say it's more cops on the street. Some people are going to say it's more programs in communities. Those fights can happen. But this expenditure is not making us safer. And so, again, I want to mention you can text chances to 21333. We have to get second look laws in place to give everyone a second look, not just those who are sick and elderly. We need compassionate release for those who are vulnerable, especially to diseases like COVID. And we need our executives, both at the federal and state level, to use their clemency power to get people out when they're serving these extreme sentences and we can't fix them in another way. So we hope you'll join us in that. Thanks for this discussion. Join us next week for another edition of our Heart to Heart series. And thanks for everybody who joined us today.